Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Unexpected Points. We're going to talk draft prognostication with Matthew Freedman of Fantasy Pros and Betting Pros. Also going to get a little bit into the Deebo Samuel news today and maybe hit a few mailbag questions if we have time. That's all this on Unexpected Points. Alrighty. I am joined by longtime friend when you consider not that many people have been in this business for a long time, Matthew Freedman. I was giving him a hard time as we got on here about the fact that he was begging me, just pleading with me to have him on the show here. So I capitulated. I almost messed up who you're working for now, too, because you have a new job every single time I see you, I think.
That is accurate. By the way, that intro feels like it takes so long to get through. Part of it is because I'm a sociopath and I listen to podcasts at 3x speed. So that is definitely part of it. But that intro felt really, really long. The intro music.
Yeah, you know what's weird is because I don't do three. You're legitimately a sociopath if you're listening to it that quickly. I think I do 1.5, and whenever I hear the music, I realize how slow it must be in real speed when I'm listening to it, and it sounds a little bit slow at the same time, or how slow people must be speaking sometimes and enunciating so well. Do you think? And I wonder about this sometimes. Do you think when you are doing a podcast, you speak too quickly because you're used to hearing people come through so quickly on your 3x speed?
Kevin, no one has ever accused me of speaking too quickly. Okay. I am a notorious slow talker. Also, I will say on the last pod you did with Rebar, that one I had to tone down to 2x because there's no way that anyone can listen to Rebar and comprehend what he's saying at 3x speed.
Yeah. He gets me a little hyped up too. I think it might be like one of those positive, negative feedback loops, whatever you call it, but depending on which directionality you want to say there, that we both start talking so quickly. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do here, is to make people slow down when they're listening. But anyway, Matthew, we are here, I believe, discussing the same thing that we discussed last year, which is the NFL draft and all of the prop action, which is kind of wrapped into a larger discussion about how we think the draft will go down. Before we get into that, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least touch on the news that is shaking the Twitter sphere right now about Deebo Samuel officially requesting a trade, which I don't know what that means, quite honestly. Like, I guess I saying he wants out doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get out, but there's been a little bit of percolating stuff out there with these younger wide receivers now that we're seeing ginormous contracts go to a few different guys this offseason. Do you have any takes for me as to, number one, whether or not the 49ers should fulfill that request if they can, the likelihood of such, all that sort of stuff?
It's all Christian Kirk's fault. I know how you feel about that. No, it's not at all his fault. The market has been trending in this direction for a little bit. I don't think they probably should trade him because like he's near peak value. He wants more money. So you're going to have to sort of if you want to keep him, you're going to have to give it to him or lose him in a year. I think trade him now while you can get a first rounder for him. Maybe even multiple first rounders for him. Turn one of those picks into a wide receiver who can work within the Shanahan system and just, rinse, wash, repeat. I like Deebo Samuel. Like he's a really intriguing player, but that's not to say like he is a one of a kind player. So I think you trade him.
Yeah. For me, when it comes to these situations is, I don't think there's a single non-quarterback trade that we have seen over the past, several years where you can really look back on it and say, oh, wow, that team was forced to get rid of this player and they didn't get good compensation for him. I mean, maybe Jalen Ramsey was probably like really that type of talent, arguably the top cornerback in the NFL type of talent. And it's something that everyone recognized. I mean, he was the number, 5 overall pick when he came out. He was, all first team all pros sort of guy. Deebo Samuel, you're right, isn't necessarily at that level. So to me, it's more about what can they get in a trade. And I'm wondering whether or not the asking price whatever it may be, it's just like the price that people are willing to give up may have gone down a bit now that the Dolphins are out of the market. So we talk about the Jets as possibly being a team that's left, but if the Jets aren't bidding against even another team, then I just don't know who's going to make this trade. Every single fan base in the NFL jumps up immediately to say, "Oh, let's do it. Let's trade away a first round and second round pick, and then pay the guy a ton of money." I'm not sure how long the line is for Deebo Samuel, especially the type of role that he has as this underneath yak receiver, where people might say, "I see a couple guys in this draft that we can replicate that, and then pay them $2 million a year in the second round."
Yeah. So Kevin, I know that your future is working in a front office. I know that. So let's put on your future front office hat and say you are the person charged of making this decision for the 49ers. What is the lowest level of draft compensation that you are willing to accept in this trade? I think even just quote unquote just a first gets it done, because then you don't have to worry about the future contract.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it depends on, you hear all this rumbling. Is it the money? Is it the usage? What is it all about? I think when the Bills initially gave up a first round pick and then got Stephon Diggs, the reason maybe it wasn't as compelling for the Vikings, and we all know what happened, right? They ended up with Justin Jefferson, so that's not going to happen every single time. But the reason maybe wasn't as compelling for the Vikings is that Diggs was on a pretty good contract. And while he did get his big payday this year, he still played for multiple years on that contract. So I guess for Deebo, it's like your best case scenario is somehow you don't do a big deal and he plays a year and maybe you franchise tag him and then you do a big deal. So yeah, I think that factor alone, that you're going to be diving straight into this big contract, I don't really see how to avoid it with his situation. Yeah, I do think a first round pick would be enough. And I know that everyone's going to think they have a really unique take where they're going to say, well, guess what? You can't just draft another Deebo Samuel with the first round pick. Your chances are like, and they're just going to ignore the contract side of it. But to me, that seems like it's good enough. Now, optically, will it be good enough? And Trey Lance comes in and Trey Lance struggles and it's because you got rid of Deebo Samuel. All those sorts of things start happening. I'm not sure. But from a pure value standpoint, not having to pay that contract and getting a first round pick sounds like a win to me.
Yeah, not having to pay the contract and then getting to throw the ball more to George Kittle. Like, how about that? Because Kittle hasn't been featured enough within that offense, and part of it was because of Deebo. Just give Kittle the ball a little bit more.
And you have Brandon Ayuk, right, who's there too. And are you going to be able to keep Kittle, Ayuk, and Deebo Samuel all on big market deals anyway, right? Like
Yeah.
eventually you may look to move one of those guys anyway. And it's also not like the most wide receiver heavy offense. Clearly every offense in the NFL now, you need a couple of capable wide receivers, but it's not, something where they have, you can roll some two tight end sets. You can roll out some multiple running back sets in that sort of offense. You can put some players in that same role as Deebo Samuel. I think maybe we're thinking Deebo has a little bit too much value in this hybrid running back role because he had some big runs. And I don't think is really replicable for him to have that much efficiency as a running back again next year. There isn't something you can necessarily point to about him physically that couldn't be fulfilled, I think, by some other very talented running backs. And the dual role is obviously a big thing there. But again, I'm not sure if NFL front offices are going to view the replaceability factor like you would for Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, and how many 3 wide receiver sets are they going to use when you have Kyle Juszczyk on the field anyway for
right,
like
exactly.
40,
I forgot
45%
about Juszczyk, who you're also paying too much money to. At least you were paying too much money to. I know the cap's moving and everything like that, but yeah, you're also paying Juszczyk, right? And the 49ers being the 49ers, they'll overdraft some running back and then not play them the entire season too. So that'll be their MO for this year also.
Yeah, they've already done that. It will be Wan'Dale Robinson, who they draft in the second round as the sort of hybrid replacement, the hybrid like running back, wide receiver, Deebo replacement.
Yeah,
That is happening.
I could see something like that happening. Okay, so we're in agreement here with Deebo, and let's get into the draft stuff now that we're talking about who teams may potentially draft. The 2021 draft, last year's draft, will might have been like the most predictable draft in a way. There's, a friend of the show, Josh Norris, who's been trumpeting his, greatest mock draft ever, which is like, has become like a meta bit now at this point that he's so far into it. And I think he got 16 of the 32 picks correct, somewhere in that neighborhood. So getting
Yes.
half the picks correct is the greatest mock ever. And that included getting 9 of the first 10 picks correct. But I feel like last year there was almost a minimum of maybe 4 picks that almost anyone was going to get correct in the first 10. This year, you could go 0 for 10 to start the first 10 picks, and it doesn't mean you're necessarily a bad, mock drafter. You don't have good information. It's just there's so many equivalent players, I feel like, at the top of every position. No one is standing out that much that you can make a case for a lot of different guys here. And the question that I have for you is kind of from a macro perspective, looking at last year's draft versus this year's draft, are there different types of bets that become more attractive in that environment, or is it a similar phenomenon year after year in the types of bets that attract you?
So last year, I think there were more bets at the top of the board that I felt comfortable making. So, for instance,
Like Mac Jones, number 3 to the to the
oh yeah,
49ers, which
yeah, I felt
which
great.
which in a
Felt great
series of
about that.
events led to you being blocked by Adam Schefter eventually, which I liked. It was that
Yeah,
that bet, I think, eventually down the road that led to you getting blocked by the most important, I'll put journalist in quotes, journalist in NFL media.
yes. So, but yeah, there are bets at the top of the board last year because of the relative certainty. So, for instance, at number 4, we knew it was either Kyle Pitts or Jamar Chase. At number 5, we knew it was either Jamar Chase or Penei Sewell. Right? Like we just kind of had this line of like, okay, if not this, then this, and you could sort of see, okay, if the Dolphins, if they're there, wide receiver available, they're taking him at number 6, and you could just sort of see all the way down the line the truncated possibilities, and that made it easier to bet into that. That isn't the case this year, where it's just wide open, relatively wide open in the top 10. So it means that a lot of the bets, who goes number 1, who goes number 2, is this team at the top? Are they taking an offensive tackle or an edge? Like those bets, some of them aren't even available this year because the books haven't put them out there, and then the ones that are available aren't as attractive. But the bets that I still think are pretty actionable this year, same as last year, same as the year before that, a lot of the draft position over unders. So Ahmad Gardner over under 7.5, right? Like because of my methodology and just aggregating mock drafts, you can get a pretty strong sense of the direction for how sharp mocks are looking at that. And even if you make an adjustment for groupthink, you could still find value on a lot of bets like that out there. And then I would also say the totals for different positions, like over under 2.5. Now the number's 3.5 at most books. Over under 3.5 quarterbacks in round 1. Over under 5.5 wide receivers in round 1. You still see almost kind of regardless of where a guy ends up going, if it's number 8 or number 15, you still see that guy going in round 1 in all of the mock drafts. And you put enough of them together and you can start to see a lot of value across the board in draft position bets and totals for different positions.
Okay, let me a couple questions here. So from a person like myself who, likes to dabble in these things but probably isn't as focused on you are on really maximizing, positive expected value here. One of my problems is I like to sometimes sprinkle a little something on something that I just want to root for in a way. And normally it's because I like a particular player more than the consensus. So I'm getting into this, what would I do? Or maybe even I'm reacting instead of using mock drafts to inform my opinion. I'm like, these guys are idiots, and this team would be an idiot if they did X, and I would do the opposite. So you know what? Let me sprinkle a little, 20-1 action on, Matt Corral to go in the top 10 picks, because that's maybe what I would do if I was the Panthers in that sort of situation. So do you shut off that part of your brain, or do you think there's anything to be gained from thinking what is the smartest move? Because I do believe that NFL front offices are smarter than NFL media.
Okay, that's interesting. I think you're right. Yeah, NFL front offices are smarter than NFL media. Of course, that
Yeah.
doesn't say much for NFL media, but the question
Non-Dave
about
Gettleman edition. The non-Dave Gettleman edition now that
right,
he's out.
the the point about what I think should happen versus what I'm seeing in the mock draft data, that is interesting. I will say sometimes it has hit me where like I'm probably too high on Treylon Burks. Like he's my number one wide receiver. I looked at the mock draft data and I'm like, okay, there are four guys who are probably going to go ahead of Treylon Burks at his own position. The number 5 receiver taken. Should I really be this high on him overall before the draft? And it probably impacted the way I was doing my early mocks, where I was thinking, all right, screw the early mock draft data. I think Treylon Burks should be in the top 2 or top 3 at the position. So I was mocking him there earlier. The thing is, I've learned I was mocking it, but I didn't bet it, and I know that's not necessarily the same thing. It's probably not best for me to be putting things out there in mocks that I wouldn't be betting, but Treylon Burks, I just knew special circumstances. But for the most part, I am able to shut off what I would do, or like how it is that I'm ranking my board versus how it is that I'm mocking and betting guys in the first round.
Okay, so that's okay. That makes sense. And because
One thing,
what do you
sorry,
know?
one thing to interrupt.
Okay,
You
go
you
ahead. Go ahead.
mentioned I
You're the
have to.
guest.
I have to.
I've invited you into my home here. So
I
go
I
continue,
forgot.
please.
You mentioned Matt Corral as top 10. I'm just gonna say, okay, the Seahawks at number 9,
Yeah.
they've been too quiet. Like, I don't think they're going to take a quarterback at number 9. If I think they take a quarterback, it's on day 2. But it would be the most Seahawks thing ever for almost nobody in the industry to be mocking them with a quarterback at number 9, even though you look at their roster and it makes all the sense in the world for them to take a quarterback at number 9. They don't even have a Sam Darnold, right? Like at least the Panthers can be like, all right, well, we feel comfortable enough with Darnold. We're on the 5th-year option. The Seahawks don't even have that excuse, and yet no one is slotting a quarterback to them. And it would be the most Seahawks thing ever in the first round for them to do the one thing that no one anticipates them doing. So you never know. Matt Corral in the top 10. I'm not betting it. I'm not betting it, but I could see it.
Yeah, what's funny because there was a little bit of buzz about that because they do these things from the combine where they have them sitting in the stadium stands. It's like, oh, they're talking. Sean Snyder and Pete Carroll are talking to Matt Corral and things like that. But I do think this is maybe the Seahawks angle that we're talking about is again maybe where I get myself into trouble is when it comes to something like quarterbacks. I'm looking at a lot of these teams and I'm like, well, why wouldn't they take a quarterback? And why would they take a quarterback? And why wouldn't they take a quarterback? Because like you talk about the Seahawks, this is a team that 2 years ago was trading away multiple first round picks for Jamal Adams for the like final piece to be a Super Bowl team, and now they're just going to give up and they're not going to try to bring anyone in, and we're just going to have a classic Geno Smith, Drew Lock quarterback battle. That makes no sense to me, but yet you're right. No one talks about it. No one talks about even like the Texans getting a quarterback where I get it. They're not doing so well, but are they really just going to say, we have multiple first round picks early and we're not going to take a shot at someone and we're going to have Davis Mills as our guy? I don't know. I'm surprised there aren't more teams that people suspect may take a quarterback when they don't have one.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I really do look forward to the days when you are a general manager and you are taking a quarterback in like the top 100 every draft.
Yeah.
Even when you have your guy, you're just going to be taking the quarterback
In like
that's
the top
there.
20, I mean, that's part of my like Carolina Panthers thing. Like for me, I'm out there, right? So I think, hey, I'll take a guy at 6, yeah, whatever. I don't have any more picks, and if it doesn't work out, and he sucks, and we're in the top 10 next year, well, you know what? I'll take another guy. I'll take another guy in the top 10 next year. Like, who cares? Like what's the big deal to me? But again, that's not the way that everyone ends up thinking. So okay, so we were talking about that. Can't think too much like myself. And by the way, I'm not going to work for an NFL team. I'm too old. And I don't have any loyalty. I have no loyalty. So, to any
Plus, they won't want to pay you the money that you're worth. Let's be honest.
Well, yeah, I mean that's probably true because I'm a little lazy also, so that also goes into part of it. That's not so good. We need to change the culture. If I could find a team that has a new culture of just like who cares? We take this guy, we take that guy, and let's have the afternoon off. Then I could go for that sort of thing. All right, so then my second thing is you are using quote unquote smart mocks. So obviously you've looked into mocks that are focusing more on accuracy versus maybe doing what I'm doing a little too much of, which is like I believe this should happen, or I'm behind the times a bit on my takes or where things are moving. My question is, even when you're maybe we'll talk a little bit about how you do that, but then even as part of that process, have you found any sort of like systematic bias in anything, whether it be certain types of receivers, being too low on quarterbacks, being too this, where then you adjust off of those smart mocks and you don't just put them into your formula and figuring out your probabilities and going straight off of them? Because I bet there are moves and I bet there are some biases in different ways. I'm not sure exactly what they are, but there has to be, right?
Yeah. So there is a degree of groupthink. So I'm always I don't do it within my quote unquote model, but I sort of mentally adjust. So if I see like, okay, 80% of the sharp mocks are pointing in this direction, I think, all right, well, maybe the real number there should be like 65%, maybe 70%. But I will always try to build in kind of a buffer, a margin of error there. But yes, to the question of are there biases that I've identified? Yeah, I mean, quarterbacks are over mocked. Which almost kind of goes against what you said of like I'd be taking a quarterback every time. Like I think people who are doing these mocks tend to have that tendency of identifying how important the quarterback position is in the NFL, thinking this team needs a quarterback and pushing quarterbacks off the board. But in a lot of mocks, even sharp mocks, quarterbacks are pushed too high into round one, where routinely we'll see 4 mocks there and only 3 go in round one. So quarterbacks really tend to be pushed up the board. And I will also say, I do think that there tends to be a little bit of a bias towards the athletic freaks in mock drafts to where they maybe get pushed up the board a little bit. So guys who really stand out at the combine, some of those guys do end up going in round one, but often, I don't want to say often, but sometimes they will be pushed up too far in mock drafts. So I do try to keep some of those things in mind when I'm looking at the sharp mocks, but that's more of like an afterwards thing, not anything that I put into the model to kind of manually adjust as it's happening.
Okay. A couple other things because I've been looking at. I don't know if you've seen the ESPN has this probability calculator that they made public on where players may go, or whether they'll be available by a certain pick. I don't know. Have you seen this by any chance or not?
I I haven't looked at it. I will look at it and then I will probably never look at it again.
Okay, yeah, that might be the way to go. I mean, it said Brian Burke, I think, has put it out. Burke, he's like a
He's
godfather
good.
in the
Yeah. Yeah.
analytic space. I mean, the critique that I would have it, and I think that Burke's even mentioned this, although he may understate it a little bit, is like the overconfidence factor. And there's two different things that I've seen. So I want to see how you think about these two different types of overconfidence. Number one is you can tell by their probabilities that they're looking at mock drafts and they say, well, this player never goes before the eighth pick in these mock drafts. So therefore, as they have a pick by pick probability that they'll go, it starts at 100% of the time he'll be there by that eighth pick. And we know that that's not true, right? Like there could be
Yeah.
a team that trades up to go get them earlier. There is something on the tails that's being ignored, even if it's not part of the mock draft space. So that's number one, is just like generally, how do we build in more uncertainty into a probability forecast, right? A probability curve. And the second thing is, which I mentioned as part of this first thing, is they have a pick by pick thing, and it'll say, I was looking at quarterbacks on the 14th pick where the Ravens are picking. It's very, very low. And then the next team, it's very, very high. Well, guess what? The Ravens may move out of 14, right? And someone else moves into 14. And then all of a sudden that could become a quarterback sort of pick. So how do you think about those two angles, which kind of go together, which is just more uncertainty than you're going to see because positions will shift around, and we can't accurately predict the guy that will fall 20 spots further than anyone is thinking, or the guy that will go 10 spots earlier than anyone's thinking.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question first of positions going to certain draft slots, and so I have it aggregated. So I could type in, like in my spreadsheet here, like pick number 14, or let's say you mentioned the Ravens, so I could type in Baltimore, and I can see okay, like they take, we'll say I have 25 sharp mocks aggregated. They take an edge defender in 11 of them, and a offensive tackle in 7 of them, and a defensive tackle in 4 of them. And it's like, hey, they don't take a quarterback in any of them. So like, yeah, if I'm looking at mock draft data, I would say there's a 0% chance. But like we know that's not realistic, as you say. And so when I'm looking at particular markets and thinking about like what is the real probability, like I'm always mentally adjusting that. So I would say like, no, it's not a 0% probability. It's more like a 5% probability. And you could probably quantify this by looking at the historical trade rates for the first round. And, you know, especially in particular type of picks, you know, where, and if people are trading up, they're probably trading up for 1 or 2 types of positions, maybe 3 or 4, but like they're trading up for certain premium positions. And so you could probably look at a pick in the teens. And even though the mock draft data might not point in a particular direction, you could say, just based on how often trades have happened in the NFL draft in the past 10 years, you know, there's a probability of a team moving up. And if they move up, there's the probability of them taking a quarterback or wide receiver or whatever it is. So that's number one. And then, yeah, number two, the point of like, okay, this player is here in 100% of the mock drafts. So his probability of being there is 100%. I did a tool last year at Action Network that kind of did something like that, like sort of aggregated mocks and then kind of smoothed it out a little bit so that we would compare the probabilities of certain players being available at certain picks with the draft market. So like I have a little sense of that, and like, yeah, you always sort of like smooth out the edges of like there's never a 100% probability of anything in the NFL draft. Like even last year, I would just do the token like, okay, 1% chance that it's Zach Wilson going number one. You know, and it's like
Yeah,
even that was probably too high, but it's like you have to smooth it out a little bit because like this is total chaos anyway, and then there's chaos on top of that with all the trades. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I mean,
you can't say anything definitive with like 100%.
yeah, I mean, I think if you're betting individual player over unders, it probably doesn't matter that much where the tails go because you're
Yeah.
concerned about where that kind of median sort of outcome is. But if you're betting X number of wide receivers to go in the first round, well, then it starts to matter if guys who are being consistently mocked in the 20s and are never being mocked in the 40s, but they really have a better chance of being in the 40s than you might think. Then it kind of matters in those sorts of discussions. So let me
Yeah.
ask you for the different types of bets we're talking about here: player over unders, totals for like first round by position, and then maybe a separate bucket of long shots. I looked through you have a list of your props that you're going here over at Betting Pros. You don't have too many of the long shots, and I think people love to talk about long shots because let's face it, it's a lot of fun to say like exactly what I was saying, like, oh, I picked Matt Corral to go in the top 10 and now I'm like 16-1, cha-ching sort of thing, than it would be to say, oh, I projected this player would go here at, minus 400 or whatever. Like no one's high-fiving you if you do something like that. So but are you getting more value on those types of bets versus the long shots?
So I did an analysis last year after the fact, looked back at the entirety of my draft prop card that was 298 bets, ridiculous number I mean, like
Seek help.
I just looked,
Seek help.
I know,
Freedom.
seriously, I looked at that number and I was like, that's too much. Like I was over levered.
You
But
don't
so I
even know what
did,
you're rooting for at that point. You're like sitting there during the draft. You need that like 5 minute, 15, whatever the window is between every bet just to like reorganize yourself on where you stand in life. Yeah.
yeah. So I did an analysis of all of that, and I found, you know what, I really suck at long shots. So
Yeah.
I'm just I took too many of them last year, and so part of it is I realized I'm just not really good at that, and I think some of that is the methodology that I'm using, like looking at the existing data instead of maybe being a little more imaginative and thinking about where might the data change. So part of that like is just a shortcoming, And then part of it is the fact that I don't think the markets are as robust this year as they were last year. And so there are fewer long shots that I think are viable. And so you put that together, and yeah, it means I have relatively few long shots. I do have, and I'll say a third thing. This year, so last year I was very into it, like basically thinking of it as like buying, selling, looking at positions, trying to anticipate where lines would move. This year, for maybe 6 weeks, I didn't place a single bet on the draft. And part of it was just because I didn't like a lot of the props that were on the board. I didn't like a lot of what I was seeing in mock drafts. It felt too uncertain. And I've been very heavy betting it the past week or so. Um, but because I didn't enter the market during that period of most of March, that means that a lot of the long shot opportunities that could have been profitable, I just didn't jump on. And some of it was like, I wouldn't have seen it anyway to jump on it. And if I had been placing long shots then, I would have been placing them on the wrong guys. So, it's not like I have a sexy story of like, I got on Travon Walker 20-1 to be the number one pick. But, I do have him at, plus 550 to be the first defensive lineman drafted. Like that's a little bit of a long shot, not like a super sexy long shot, but like I did get on that. But other than that, yeah, I don't really have any long shots.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking that you said it's not as robust this year, but I mean, I assume it's like the more uncertainty there is, the less you want to put out early because then you leave yourself vulnerable, or maybe there's another reason for why books aren't offering as much as they are. And I guess maybe just as like a logical rule, I would say, like, what's the most fun thing to bet on? That's probably the worst return you're gonna you're gonna get on
Yeah,
on whatever that is. So
probably.
that's part of it.
Yeah. And I would say some of it is the books, like they got beat last year. And I think they sort of learned the lesson of like, we don't need to put out as many props that expose us. People will bet on the things that we put out, and let's minimize our exposure a little bit. And then the other thing is this class just isn't as much fun as last year's was. We had 7 skill position players go in the top 10 last year. Like that is fun to bet on. We might
Yeah.
get 2, maybe 3 skill position players in the top 10 this year.
And
Last year
people
we had
just
2
know
running.
those players better, right? If
Yeah,
you're just gonna have your average
exactly.
Joe on the street, he's gonna know these quarterbacks better than the edge rushers, probably beyond the first few guys, and obviously
Yeah.
they're not valued nearly as highly.
Yeah, exactly. So there's just less interest in this year's draft, like less enthusiasm with it than there was last year's.
Okay, so after this very long introduction and strategizing and process here, what are you still looking at now? And let's talk maybe the top of the draft first. Man, I'm trying to think of like the logical order to think about here. Do you have anything that you're seeing here? Any opinions about? You mentioned Trayvon Walker. The whole Hutchinson thing. It was like Hutchinson was the guy, then he maybe wasn't the guy, then he went back to being the guy, and now maybe it's more of a maybe now. Where do you stand on how things are gonna play out these first couple of picks? Probably first 2 picks is really what people are concentrated on.
Yeah, so I will say if you are of the opinion that Aiden Hutchinson is the number one guy, I think the way to exploit that is to bet on Travon Walker to go number 2. And you can get him at, I did this morning at plus 550 at Caesars. However, I think Walker's going to be the guy at number 1.
Hmm.
And yesterday we saw, and in my mock draft that I do next, I will have Walker number 1. Now, in the prop market we saw yesterday at number 2, some serious movement on Kayvon Thibodeau to go, not Aiden Hutchinson, which is really suspicious because I think if Hutchinson is available at number 2, I think he's a smash there. Like I think the Lions don't even think about it. They're taking him at number 2. And I remember that you and I had a Twitter exchange, maybe it was just DM exchange last year, the day of the draft when the news or the lines were shifting dramatically away from Mac Jones and towards Trey Lance. And I said, like, this is the one day during the year where if you see the prop market moving, I will trust what we're seeing there versus the mock drafts. So at this point, I am still with the mocks. Hutchinson should be ahead of Kayvon Thibodeau. The market movement yesterday doesn't really factor into the way I'm viewing this. I think Hutchinson is a near mortal lock for the top two. But it is a little bit weird that we saw that market movement yesterday, as if someone knows something, but the lines makers, even now, it doesn't take much for them to move a line. So it could just be someone coming in with $1,000 betting on Kayvon Thibodeau. They move the line. Other books see the line moved at this book, so they move in coordination. So I'm not putting too much on that, but it is notable that Kayvon Thibodeau is now the favorite to go number 2, not Hutchinson, not Travon Walker, but I still think Travon Walker, number 1, Aiden Hutchinson, number 2.
Yeah, I mean, it seems absolutely insane to me that these decisions would not be made like maybe even weeks in advance for what we're seeing from these guys. But I
Yeah.
believe it. I believe it because I think the one thing that people don't necessarily appreciate enough is that, like, let's go back to this whole Trey Lance, Mac Jones fiasco from last year. I kind of believe I know, I know you're anti-Schefter now, but I kind of believe his side of the story. I kind of believe his side of the story that they did think it was going to be Mac Jones. And then eventually something ended up happening. And I can easily see in these things, I think the element people don't recognize is like the ownership element in this. But I
Yeah.
think what people don't really recognize is when there's a disagreement, even if someone is kind of like the decision maker and what's going to happen, if there is a disagreement, if someone can get in the owner's ear and say, it's basically a coin flip between these guys, but let me tell you why it should be this guy instead. And then the owner says, okay, well, we're going to take that guy instead. Then that can happen. And I would not be surprised if that happens right before the draft or in the week leading up to the draft. It's not like the owner's sitting in on all of these meetings and other stuff. He has different people in his ear potentially, or her ear when it comes to Detroit, potentially, and then that ends up being made. So it seems totally out of whack that these billion-dollar organizations could just be flipping from one way to another near the end in the last week. And you read these stories about them being torn and you think this is ridiculous, but I think it can actually be the case.
Yeah, I think it is the case, and part of it is because of the process of collecting information. Like they're still collecting information up until the last minute, like medical information, background checks on guys, and then sorting the positions and then stacking the board. And so that's just sort of the process of putting all of your data into a format. And then on top of that, there's the process of decision making, right? And with the Jags at number 1, ownership, it seems, wants Aiden Hutchinson. GM Trent Baalke probably wants Travon Walker because he's in
So how
that
much do
that
you believe?
Aiden.
Okay, so
Yeah.
okay, the Balky story about Balky is anti Harbaugh so that he wouldn't want Aiden
Oh,
Hutchinson.
that's
Like
just
when you
that's
hear,
just me making stuff
oh,
up.
that's just because I've heard stuff like that. I even saw something about a Jaguars insider who I think actually got something drastically wrong earlier this year. I can't remember what it was though. Was saying something about like was getting some sort of text from someone within the organization saying, "Do you really think that Balky would, not go for Hutchinson just because of animus towards Harbaugh?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, definitely that could happen." And I'm thinking to myself, like, does that actually affect your opinion at all, or is it more of a broader landscape on what's happening with Mox?
Well, okay, I will just say, like that doesn't really factor into my analysis of this,
Yeah.
but Trent Baalke, like I just say, there's something about this guy, like in his heart, he does not want to take Jim Harbaugh's golden boy. Like he does not want to. That does. I don't think it's going to factor into whether they ultimately will or won't. But like personally, like he would hate that.
I
And
just
then
figure
that's
guys like
separate.
Balky are really good at sucking up to ownership, and that's how they end up getting to these jobs again. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
I mean, fair enough. I think Balky has shown that he's really adept at destroying an organization. But other than that, anyway, and then so those are the two edge rushers, and then you have the coaching staff. And I mean, reports are they want an offensive tackle to protect their quarterback. They're more of the offensive minded coaching staff. You have Evan Neal, you have Ikem Ekwonu, either one of which I think arguably could be a good number 1 pick. And they're like, hey, why wouldn't we protect the guy that we just spent the number 1 pick on last year? So you put all of that together, and it's like, who really knows? Who knows what's going to happen at the top of the draft?
Right, but you can pick through, as you're mentioning, not just saying I have to choose who's going to go first, but you can look at value at second and other places for what may end up happening. Okay, so I'm looking through some of these other bets that you have here. Okay, so doing something like Sauce Gardner in the top 10 at minus 650. Again, like, who's betting that other than like the degenerate who's not actually, I don't even know if that is even a degenerate bet. I don't know what that is. It seems more cold and calculating in a same sort of
Yeah,
way because you're getting no high fives for that. You're not taking pictures and tweeting out your tickets on stuff like this.
yeah. Thank you for picking like the most unsexy of the bets that I
I'm
made
leaning
this
into your
morning.
brand. I'm leaning into your brand here.
Yeah, no, my brand is definitely wet blanket. No, there's nothing great about that bet. It's just a plus EV bet, and I'm not, it's minus 650. It's not as if I'm putting 6.5 units on it. I'm not over leveraging on it. It's just like, okay, I see value on this. I want to get a little bit of exposure. I'll put a unit on it, and I'll look to profit like 0.15 units or whatever it is. That's not great, but little bets like that add up. I will say, thinking about the top of the board a little bit more, Evan Neal, I do think there's
Hmm.
value on him versus Akim Ekwonu, because if you look in the markets right now, Ekwonu is the higher rated guy to be the first offensive lineman. He's got better odds to be the number one pick versus Evan Neal. But in the mock draft data, the sharp mocks that I'm looking at, across the board, Neal is ahead of Ekwonu. And I think even from a quote unquote real life football perspective, you can make the case of Neal versus Ekwonu. Ekwonu is the more aggressive, better run blocker. Like, he's got the sexier tape in that he just like pancakes multiple dudes whenever he's out run blocking. But Neal is the more polished player. He's the better pass blocker. And I think he's got a little more in terms of versatility. He's started a season at right tackle, started a season at left tackle, started a season at guard. I think he probably should go ahead of Ekwonu, and that's nothing against Ekwonu, who should be a lock for the top five. But I think Neal offers value at plus money to go ahead of Ekwonu as the number one offensive lineman in the class.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. What about the like Charles Cross factor? Does that, because I know some people, I think maybe even PFF, now that I mean, so some people, I think we may even have him higher on our big board, not like predicting what's actually going to happen. Does he factor it all into the analysis?
A little bit, but I'll say in the sharp mocks, he's pretty cleanly behind both Neal and Ekwonu. And I can't really find a spot for him unless the Panthers go with an offensive tackle at number 6. And in one of the early mocks I did have them going with Charles Cross there. Unless the Panthers go offensive tackle at number 6, I think it's hard to find a perfect spot for him in the top 10. Like, I could see him going Seattle at number 9. That's where I have him mocked now, but I still don't think that's even all that great of a fit. Cross is more of the pass blocking offensive lineman, but it's rough because he didn't have to do a lot of run blocking in college because of the system he played in, and he didn't have to hold like his blocks a long time because it was a quick passing system. So it's more of a projection to him with the NFL. And like, I think he'll be fine. Like, I think he should very easily be the number 3 tackle in this class. But I do think there's a pretty significant tier between Neal and Ekwonu as the top 2 and Cross as the number 3.
Okay, so what's interesting to me is this year is a little of a unique circumstance with the Jets and the Giants in the top 10, right? Because you have the Jets at 4 and 10 and the Giants at 5 and 7 with the Panthers sandwiched between them there. That, like, how does that factor into this offensive tackle discussion? Because like I could see the Jets wanting to get out of, when they're done picking at 10, maybe they want a tackle and a wide receiver, let's say, or something like that. So they're probably going to want to go tackle, I would assume, at 4 then at that point, because there'll probably only be one at most off of the board already at that point. Same with the Giants. Like, if there's still one of the two big tackles left, they probably pull that lever there. Maybe not as much for Cross or go somewhere else. How are you thinking about those two teams? Because I do think there's some interesting um, game theory sort of aspects for them when they want to get out with certain types of positions in a draft where you're not necessarily saying best player available, even for teams that are lacking talent, because of the fact that they're all muddled together as far as their talent range. Have you thought all about that kind of like dual outcome that they need for having these two different picks, both of those teams?
Yeah, I love that question because it's not just the Jets and the Giants in the top 10. You have the Eagles and the Saints with a
Hmm.
similar dynamic having to
Right.
move around each other in the teens. And then you have even a little bit the Packers and the Chiefs having to negotiate because they might have similar interests, like wide receiver and edge. You could see both of those teams targeting those two positions in the 20s and at 30. So yeah, it's really intriguing to think about how those teams move around each other. And so I would think that the Jets, I'll just say, I think it's likelier that they go edge wide receiver instead of offensive tackle and wide receiver. But if they go offensive tackle, yeah, they're going to need to take that guy at number 4 because the Giants are definitely, well, I don't want to say definitely, can't put 100% on this, but I think it's likely that the Giants are going offensive tackle with one of their 2 picks. And I would expect if we think, okay, offensive tackle, you take him at 5 because there's a chance the Panthers take him at number 6 if you let him slide.
Right.
And then if you think you're the Giants and you want Ahmad Gardner, even if you have Gardner ahead of the offensive tackle you might take, Gardner's not going to the Panthers at number 6. Like, very good probability Gardner is available to you at number 7. So you take the
Yeah,
offensive
they're probably
tackle
not taking a
first.
cornerback in the top 10 back-to-back years. Probably not, right?
Yeah, probably not. So, I think if you're the Giants, you go offensive tackle at number 5, wait for Gardner. He will almost certainly fall to you at number 7 because the Panthers, they don't have an interest in, I mean, no one's going to trade up to number 6 for Sauce Gardner. And then, yeah, if you're the Jets, you don't take, in my opinion, you don't take a wide receiver at number 4 because a guy that same receiver even might be available to you at number 10, and if he's not, someone who's probably comparable enough in quality will be available at number 10. If you think you want an edge or an offensive tackle, they better take him at number 4 because there's a high probability that guy won't be available at number 10.
Okay, let's talk about some other positions maybe because we've talked about some tackles and edge a decent amount here. So let's talk. Let's just go ahead and talk quarterbacks first, even though they may not be the main position. So what are your takes? Because again, I'm just mocking quarterbacks. Everyone gets a quarterback. The Panthers are the big one, right? We have already mentioned Josh Norris here, who seems to be pretty adamant about the fact that he thinks the Panthers are going to go veteran and maybe trade back or do something like that. I can't tell if that is something that he thinks he has inside knowledge on, his own logical conclusion, or if this is like a fan projection on the fact that he thinks all these quarterbacks stink and he doesn't want to draft them and have that there. What do you think about them? Because they're kind of the most interesting team. And I mean, maybe the Lions could go quarterback, but that just really seems more like we're trying to make a story out of something.
Yeah, I mean, with Josh, it might be that he's in Keith Hernandez mode right now. We're thinking about what happens at number 6, but no, I
Yeah.
mean, I can see it. I will say in my last mock draft, I had Kenny Pickett going to Carolina, and like I have been torn on this for the past couple of weeks about what to do with the Panthers at number 6. And I'll just say with Pickett, he has I think the widest range of outcome of any of the guys that I'm looking at right now. And so to put numbers on this with Pickett, his average of the sharp index that I have, his average is 16.2, his median is 19, but his mode is 6. So like it is all over the board with him. And I believe that I have bet the over on his player prop of 12 and a half. Because if he doesn't go number 6, and increasingly I think he does not go number 6, I don't see how he goes in the top 12. I think
Yeah.
that it's unlikely. So this question of what to do with the Panthers, I'm increasingly leaning towards the idea that if they stay put, they draft a tackle, or they try to trade down. And maybe if they do that, they end up taking one of these quarterbacks in the teens. but I don't think if they're at 6, they are taking a quarterback there. And I would like to get your thoughts on this, but also like the McAdoo press conference where he was like, Sam Darnold is our starter. And then a minute later, I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
I don't know.
what are your thoughts there?
I'm not going to read too much in the McAdoo thing. I guess if you were going to read into it, you'd read into it that they're not going to draft someone, and that's why he may have said it. But we've seen many. Maybe again, he could. You could also flip it around and say that he's the offensive coordinator. Like, what the hell does he might not even have that great of an idea necessarily what they're going to do in the draft. Anyway, well, I don't know how it works in these organizations. So you could flip it around to saying that he shouldn't make promises that they're going to break in a week. But I do think Sam Darnold has a good chance of starting if they draft someone, right? If they draft someone, Sam Darnold has a pretty good chance of starting week 1. So, okay, so here's my thing. And again, I'm going to look at this logically, which maybe makes no sense. Like, I just don't get it. With Rule has been, and this whole Panthers organization, starting with bringing in Teddy Bridgewater and, bringing in Robbie Anderson that first year and bringing in other players and trying to compete the long way. Like, he doesn't have another year to the Sam Darnold experience for another year. That's not going to cut it, right? But at the same time, if you think about their options, so one option would be trade back and take a quarterback in the teens. Who like I just don't know who does that. Like, I don't know what team says, you know what we're going to do? We really love this quarterback. So what we're going to do is we're going to move back 8, 9 spots and then draft him. Like, I don't know. That sounds risky to me, unless they're like, we'll just take anyone at that point. So that's why I'm a little less credulous that something like that will happen. Number 2 is, they sign up, they go from mutual disinterest to a shotgun wedding with Baker Mayfield, or they go Jimmy Garoppolo. To me, unless you get major salary relief on this, I cannot imagine going into your season to be like, guess what? We have Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold at $36 million. Or we have Sam Darnold and Jimmy Garoppolo at $45 million this year in order to go 7-10 and not make the playoffs. Like, isn't everyone getting fired in these different situations? Both of them on the last year of their contracts also. So then, like, what are you doing after that? What is your plan after that? So I agree. They don't have a second round pick. They don't have a third round pick. They don't have a fourth round pick. They fucked it up. Okay. They fucked it up. But guess what? You're in it already. You have decent pieces. The defense wasn't necessarily that bad. Like, if you're Fritterer, at least, Rule may not survive no matter what, but if you're a Fritterer, draft a quarterback. If you're bad this year, you could probably still survive until next year. And then again, you can always go ahead and maybe even take someone else the next year if you really have to with your full complement of picks. I just don't see how you punt this season, because Sam Darnold will cause everyone to get fired by week 5.
I hear you on the on point number 2, especially love it. Point number 1, I think because Fritterer is not attached to Rule, he can
Yes.
probably take a little more of the longer game of being like, we don't, not 2, not 3, not 4, like, we don't have these picks in the middle rounds. Let's trade back just so we can get a second, and this quarterback will still be there. And if he's not, I don't care, because you're going to get fired anyway.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, another part is like the whole, if like next year, we'll go to next year. Like, again, they're a team that has been constructed, believe it or not, to compete, right? Not to, in a way, to compete. Now they have cap space, so they do have cap space that they cleared out as part of the Deshaun Watson, fiasco, that everything went on there. So maybe that's not necessarily the case, but I don't know, man. I don't know. I just. And like, I don't care about taking a shot at someone at 6 and having it not work, because, it's not one of these situations where the cost doesn't matter if it's a quarterback. It's just like, I just don't know what moves the needle. Like, bringing in an offensive tackle and then bringing in a veteran who no one's going to be that excited about, who only has a year left on their contract. Like, I don't understand how you're fired up about this team unless they make the playoffs. And I think the chances of that would be extremely low.
Yeah, that's fair. And one thing, I think it's going to be hard for the Panthers to trade back from number 6,
Yes.
because I see a pretty significant tier break between the guys in the top 5. You have Hutchinson, Walker, Neal, Thibodeau, and Ekwonu. I think that's a pretty clean top 5. And then after that, it's like, okay, yeah, Gardner is fine as the number 6 talent in the class, but I still think there's a pretty big difference between those top 5 and Gardner. And I don't know if anyone's going to want to trade up for a cornerback at number 6. So I think the Panthers, I think they're just screwed, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I think they're at 6 unless one of these players, unless it's maybe like Aquanu falls to number 6. But if that happens, I think they just might take him, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a really weird situation that they're in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because I think also you mentioned how quiet it's been with the Seahawks. There is a team that could potentially trade up, I guess, if they wanted to decide they're going to get a quarterback. But even though the Giants maybe should be thinking about a quarterback at 7, they're probably not thinking about one. The Atlanta Falcons are a weird one because they get mocked a quarterback a lot. But if there was a team where I said, you know what, we could have the number 1 pick next year, it's the Atlanta Falcons. So for them, unlike the Panthers, who I feel like will not be the number 1 pick, even with Sam, I mean, they were like 3-0 with Sam Darnold to start the year last year. Even with Sam Darnold, I don't think they're going to be the number 1 pick contention. I wouldn't mess up your chances of maybe getting the number 1 pick if I'm the Atlanta Falcons. So that's a team that I would pass on. Then you mentioned the Seahawks, very quiet. I think they should take someone, but who knows what'll end up happening there. And then the Jets, then the Commanders, then the Vikings. It's just there isn't a lot there for someone who may potentially take a quarterback. So yeah, why trade up into that spot if you wanted to take a shot at a quarterback? I think most teams would be content then to wait for the teens to see if their guy is there to maybe move up a few spots instead of moving up all the way that's going to cost them, a second round pick or a first round pick to do so.
Yeah, you mentioned the Falcons there. It makes me think they should do like full Jimmy Clausen, where they take a quarterback in the second round. Maybe it's Sam Howell who falls to them in the second
Yes.
round, something like that. Take one of these. We've got the top 5 quarterbacks. Whichever one falls to you in the second round, take him. Give him a shot. If he doesn't work out, it doesn't matter. You're taking Cam Newton next year. So, I think the Falcons should definitely do that. And I will say the Saints, they are an intriguing team with those 2 picks in the middle of the first round, where some beat reporters, multiple beat reporters are saying they could be looking quarterback. I really don't know if I believe that.
Why they sign Andy Dalton if they wanted to get a quarterback?
Exactly. Why
Yeah.
Jameis Winston? Why Andy Dalton if you're going to take a quarterback? And maybe it's, we take this guy, but we don't think he's NFL ready. We feel like he needs some more time, and that feels like
Or why make the trade so far in advance, right? If you had it makes no logical sense, but then again, we are talking about the Saints here. So I cannot say there's so many times I've never seen more universal expectation / disappointment when they traded up in 2018. Everyone's like, okay, here comes Lamar Jackson. Everyone was buying their Lamar Jackson Saints jerseys, and then they drafted Marcus Davenport, and that went the way that it did. Okay, so again, one thing I was going to mention really fast about Arthur Smith. The only reason, I don't know if Arthur Smith is going to survive. The guy aged like 17, 20 years just last season and how he looks here. So if he has to go through a Marcus Mariota season with that team, maybe he'd be the only one who's like, we got to do something. I won't survive until next year. I'll be on the outside, he's 47 or something, but he'll be like 80 on the inside after another season on the Falcons.
I mean, he's got an old sounding name, and now he's got the body.
He is a
the
billionaire,
face.
though. He is a billionaire.
Yeah, that's true.
So maybe he could do some sort of. Maybe he can just like inhibit. They can like download his brain into another younger, fresher body after he's worn out this one with the billions of dollars there. Okay, so let's talk wide receivers next a bit here because everyone, like, again, this is you think you could put a quarterback into every single slot. You could put wide receiver into like 2 wide receivers. Everyone's like, Packers are going to use both of their picks on wide receivers or something like that. So you can slot them in everywhere. I get the angle that the cost is going up. Everyone wants to get out of their contract, so that's part of it. But I feel like if we were having this conversation a year or 2 ago, there would have been this feeling of, you know what, you can wait on wide receiver because there's so many good wide receivers available and it's so deep. So I don't know how those 2 conflicting opinions go against each other when trying to decide. People are very high on the number of wide receivers that are going to be taken in this first round.
Yeah, that's right. People are high on it, but I think it makes sense in part because of as you said, the market, and then just the teams that have multiple first round picks, and so it's pretty easy just to slot a wide receiver to them. Thinking of like the Ravens last year, they had 2 first rounders, just slot them a first round wide receiver. It's almost too easy in the mocks, and so we could see potentially 5 wide receivers go in the top 20. And that's before you're even getting to the Patriots. I doubt they take a wide receiver, but you could justify it if they do it. And then you have the Packers with 2 picks. You could see the Cardinals potentially take a wide receiver. I doubt it, but you could see it happening. Maybe Dallas, like no one really expected CeeDee Lamb when they drafted him. I mean, potentially they could take a wide receiver. And then the Chiefs at the end of the first round, you could see them taking a wide receiver. So it's almost too easy to just hammer over 5.5 as the total number of wide receivers going in round one. But I think it's the right bet, pretty easily the right bet.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not so sure about the Cowboys. I remember for the CD Lamb was kind of, again, looking back on that. At the time, it was like a luxury-ish sort of pick, and it was a talent, like, we can't believe he fell to us sort of pick. I'm not sure if there'll be the same dynamic at this point with like, I don't know if there's a player, because then it was more like Ruggs, it was overdrafted, of course, and then CD Lamb and then Jerry Judy were kind of seen as being this real top three. So then when Lamb slid down, I don't think there is the solidified top three in that same sort of way for this one. So I'm not quite as sure about that. And yeah, we the Patriots obviously are not going to take a wide receiver because we know that Bill Belichick can't draft wide receivers, so therefore they should never take one again. That's what I've heard, and I'm just going to go with that, right?
Yeah, of course. That's an intelligent way to approach this. And like I think you're right. Like it's not likely that the Cowboys are going to take a wide receiver, but I would say like it's within the range of outcomes.
Sure.
And so you add all of these little probabilities together for some of these teams like the Patriots, the Cardinals, the Cowboys, they're not likely to take a wide receiver, but you add it all together and it's like, well, you can see how it happens between one of those 3 teams, but you don't even need to include those teams to have over 5.5 is a pretty decent bet. And I will say with the Cowboys, I don't think Jerry is going to have as much enthusiasm for Treylon Burks as he had for CeeDee Lamb back in the day. But Burks and this is just like pure narrative, but like Burks based on like the skill set that he has, like they can hand him the ball, the big bodied slot. Although I think he could succeed outside, and then coming from Arkansas, like I don't know if Jerry's going to see Burks at 24 if he's there and like want to pass on him.
Yeah, yeah, I could see that. I mean, they do have a lot invested in Dak, so maybe they'll want to, kind of enhance what they're getting there. He's gonna have a huge cap number coming up in a couple of years. Um, okay, one player who I wanted to talk to you about because I noticed that you have here. I'm not sure what the number is now. Well, it's only from yesterday, April 19th. You have Jordan Davis at over 14.5. I'm a little bit ambivalent about him because I think about him from an athletic freak sort of standpoint and say, well, someone's going to take a shot on that, right? Someone's going to take a shot on that. Maybe teams are a little bit more interested in having bigger interior linemen with this whole too high thing. But then again, he's not really known as being like a run stuffer, plug 2 gap sort of guy anyway. He's obviously nowhere near some of these guys on the production measures, but you could make a case of, well, Derek Brown went in the top, what was it, 7 or something like that when he went. Vita Vea was one of the best picks of the last several years as a guy who's kind of also somewhat of a freaky athlete. He's a little shorter and again, a little more like a run stuffing sort of guy. What makes you confident that teams are going to pass on this tantalizing athleticism that he presents?
It's a good question. So part of it is what I mentioned before, in that on kind of retroactive research, seeing that the guys who are physical freaks tend to be pushed up the mock draft boards a little more than they should based on where they get drafted, and then also some of it is the position. Defensive tackle, it's a devalued position in the NFL. Like Aaron Donald aside, largely a devalued position. And even think of like Aaron Donald, like where he went in the draft. Like he should have gone much higher than he did. He should be valued more than he is now in the NFL. I mean, everyone basically says like, oh, he's the best player in the league, but like, I mean, nowhere do you see him in MVP votes or anything like that. But this is kind of going aside of the question. Jordan Davis, defensive tackle. It's hard to figure out where to slot a defensive tackle because it's not a big need for any of these teams that are picking, we'll say 1 through 13. You can see the Ravens, as a defensive tackle team, but they just re-signed Calais Campbell. So they don't necessarily even need interior of the defensive line as much. And the Texans, they have so many needs all over that I think it might be harder for them to take a defensive tackle. So part of it is the position he plays. Part of it is that he's an athletic freak, and those guys just get pushed up the board a little bit more than they should. And then part of it is just team needs early in the draft. Like I can see Jordan Davis being drafted in the top 10, but it's not really there in the data that I tend to rely on.
Okay, another guy who's been talked about almost ad nauseum as far as whether he'll go, where he'll go or not, is Kyle Hamilton. I see you have over 10.5 here, plus 105, which what I'm looking at here is still the case here at DraftKings. So he's been a guy who's sliding, right?
Yeah,
Generally, I don't know if has there been any, is it solidified at all, or are we still in free fall mode at this point?
it's it's still free fall. I mean, like you could see the Texans were in the early process a team at number 3 who were occasionally getting him in mocks, and so they have needs all over. Kyle Hamilton is a good player, even though he doesn't have the speed to back up that statement. He's still a good player. You saw that in college football for multiple seasons. 13 is a perfectly justified spot where he could land. But I mean, he could slide past number 13 pretty easily. And if that happens, you're looking at the Eagles at 15 or maybe at 18. You could make a case for the Saints potentially addressing the defensive side of the ball. But I mean, they traded up with some guys in mind. Like, I think they're looking offensive tackle and wide receiver. So even if Kyle Hamilton is there when the Saints are on the board, and maybe even if they think, okay, we have a safety spot that is open, we could take him and he's added value, even then, they still might like other players more. So the Kyle Hamilton slide could continue. And right now, I'm looking at the mock draft data. He goes over 10.5 in 84% of sharp mocks.
Hmm.
Like, even if you adjust, like, this isn't even close. Like, this is a slam. Put as much money as you can on this type of bet.
Yeah, yeah. It's. I mean, we've gone from the discourse of is Kyle Hamilton the best player in this draft to now outside of the top 10. And I mean, I guess if you're going to lean like in a certain direction, if we're going to talk about quarterbacks being players you should draft earlier because of their value, wide receivers being players you should draft earlier because of how they're being valued in the league. I mean, a safety, you're gonna like, hey, I can just go and look in the bargain basement wherever, and just pick out a couple and bring them over. They're just not that expensive. I mean, they did just lose Marcus Williams not that long ago in a pretty big contract to the Ravens, as you mentioned with the Saints, so they have that slot kind of open, but still the surplus value that you're getting on that type of position is fairly low. So I'll be interested to see. I mean, is this a Derwin James type of situation who ended up falling until the late teens when
Yeah,
he
I
ended
think
up
Derwin
going?
James went number 17,
Yeah, yeah,
and like Kyle Hamilton, even though he has a James-esque type of skill set, he
yeah.
doesn't have anything close to Derwin James' athleticism.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I've also heard this argument that maybe the bigger kind of dual skill set safety is more valuable in these two high systems versus an Earl Thomas middle of the field guy. I don't know. That again, that kind of I see it as, I feel like the NFL has kind of been a little bit of the opposite way, where you've had these high. If a guy could be like a hybrid linebacker safety who plays safety, they've kind of been devalued even more. I feel like in some circumstances, like guys like Landon Collins have just been way like an awful free agent pickup for the Washington football team at the time and other things. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one that aligns with the logic of the situation. Um, let me see, what other position players here? Do you have any good running back takes? Or are we just fading the possibility that guys who I think objectively look good, like if you didn't tell me going into this draft, if you didn't tell me that Brees Hall and Kenneth Walker were never being mocked in the first round, basically, if you didn't tell me that and you just like dropped me onto the planet and all I could see is their stats and their Just Bombs highlight videos, I would be like, oh, these guys are going in the first round, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially if you consider that we had 2 running backs in the first round last year. And I
Yeah.
mean, okay, Travis Etienne is a better receiver, at least I think, than Brees Hall. And
Mhm.
I would say, like Najee Harris, maybe a better runner than Kenneth Murray. Maybe not, but certainly a better all around player because he's got the receiving skill set. So I can see why those guys went in the first round last year, and maybe these guys don't go in the first round. But I still think even if they go in the second round, Brees Hall, I think he's a 3 down back. Kenneth Walker, I said Kenneth Murray before. Kenneth Walker, I think he's got underappreciated potential because he hasn't shown the receiving ability, but it still might be there. And even if not, maybe he can still turn into like a Nick Chubb type of weapon. I think Isaiah Spiller is being grossly underappreciated. Like, I don't think it matters that he isn't all that athletic.
Right.
He's
Maybe the
got the
flip side of
production.
the athleticism argument that you made about guys being pushed up, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's got the 3 years of college production. He's got the receiving ability. He's young. He produced in the SEC. He was a highly recruited or highly touted recruit. So there's a lot of reason to be bullish on him. And then I will even say Brian Robinson, like, I'm interested. If he goes in the top
Yeah.
100, if he goes on day 2, I want Brian Robinson in fantasy.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I wasn't as high on him until I started to really look through it. Yeah. He looks like he's a guy who can, I mean, he's big, and the age thing maybe doesn't bother me as much if you're sitting behind some other guys who are, you
Right.
know, Damian Harris and Najee Harris. It's not as big of a deal. And I don't know, he's Alabama, so maybe he'll end up getting pushed up a little bit further than what some people think too. But you're still assuming that no one's going to go in the first round.
Oh, absolutely. And I will take it a step further and say I think you should be betting on under 0.5 running backs to go in round 1. And this number is anywhere from like minus 175 to minus 200. That is egregious. I will just say that is absolutely egregious. And I think it is driven primarily by the fact that uh, someone like Daniel Jeremiah, who I have respect for him, like as an analyst and a mock drafter, like he is sharp, but he's got a big audience, and so when he puts someone like Brees Hall in his round 1 mock, I think books pay attention to that. Your general better might pay attention to that, and they bet on this more than they should. I will just say, out of all of the other sharp mocks that I look at, almost no one is putting a running back in round 1.
Now,
So Jeremiah is really like standing on an island out there pretty much by himself, putting Brees Hall in the top 32.
now I'm not sure about where he is. Is he going to the Bills?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the whole Bills
Number
thing,
25. Yeah.
like the Bills are the only team that's probably been connected on there, and I like to think that the Bills are a smart organization. I'm not quite sure, honestly. They did take back-to-back third-round running backs. They did, make an offer for why is his name escaping me now? The Washington running back, the pass catching guy, who was reneged on.
McKissick.
McKissick, yeah, they did make that. So I guess I wouldn't put it past them. It would be such a luxury pick, awful sort of move that we would just have to all shake our heads for. But that ends up happening a little bit more often than we like to hear. But yeah, that's probably the only chance of him going in there too. Are there any like position groups or particular bets that I have not brought to your attention that that you want to talk about?
Let me take a quick look here. I mean, some of them are unsexy, so I won't mention them. I mean, quarterbacks, I want to hit on this again. Under 3.5. I really like that number. Minus 172 at FanDuel. I'm skeptical that we see 4 guys go in the first round. Like, let's just remember, mocks tend to be too high on quarterbacks. This is a bad quarterback class. Like, let's not lose sight of that. Like, I tend to be a rookie optimist, but like I'm wide-eyed enough to know that like this is a bad quarterback class, especially relative to what we've seen in recent years. And then just on top of that, or just maybe we'll say setting that aside, 76% of the sharp mocks are on under 3.5 quarterbacks. So
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's the right
I'm
side
getting
there.
I'm getting some maybe like Drew Lock, Deshaun Kaiser vibes from some of these guys where there are reasons you could get excited, but then they end up falling to the middle of the second round and everyone's like, "Oh yeah,
Yes.
that was the right thing."
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So we have the quarterbacks on here. Any other position groups? I try not to pay attention to anything but the skill players. I noticed you have, well, actually, one guy I want to talk about because he's just an interesting guy to talk about here. is I notice you have Jahan Dotson over. You're over on a lot of these guys. So Jahan Dotson over 32.5, and you also have George Pickens over 36.5. I think Pickens is become a little bit of a darling, even though despite the fact that maybe nerds like us don't like the fact that he hasn't done anything for 3 years. Um, and Dotson is like 70 pounds or something like that. So I don't quite necessarily get where he fits in, but maybe he can fit into a role that some teams have seen there. Well, why are you confident in those guys being second rounders?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm confident. It's just the probabilistic play based on the lines and the odds. Like, I do think so. To put this in perspective, I do think that we see over 5.5 wide receivers in round one.
Right.
So if that happens, either Dotson or Christian Watson or George Pickens, one of those guys has to go in round one, or setting aside Sky Moore, but one of those guys has to go
So
in
Sky
round one.
Moore's already in that scenario.
No, no, he's
No.
not.
Okay.
We'll setting him aside. But
Okay.
so to go over 5.5, one of those guys will need to get
Oh,
in.
right.
So
5.5. Sorry. I thought you were saying 6.5. Go ahead. Go
yeah.
ahead.
So I'm admitting that there's a chance that Dotson goes in round one, and there's a chance that Pickens goes in round one. But the odds are that they don't, right? And so it's just, I'd say, this is a simplistic way of looking at it, but we'll say like a 30% or 33% chance. We'll say 30% chance it's Dotson, 30% chance it's Watson, 30% chance it's Pickens that goes in round one. Because I do think, again, we see 6 wide receivers in round one, and we'll say maybe a 10% chance it's Sky Moore. But I mean, that's still just like a 30% chance that the guy goes in round one. So I think that means that there is value, like probabilistic value, on Dotson to go over, I think the number was 32.5, and for Pickens to go over 36.5. So it's not that like I feel massively confident that this guy won't go in round one, because like I'm admitting there's a chance he does. But I think the odds are, especially Dotson over 32.5 at plus money, plus 115, that just feels like too much value, especially when he's in only 40% of the sharps. So it's just, that's a bet that I really like.
Yeah, I mean, that one in particular, I like. I just don't see why he's necessarily any better than, of course, everyone's going to make the comparison to KJ Hamler coming out of the same place, but why you necessarily would draft him any earlier. And yeah, we haven't really seen those guys, those little tiny guys, translate over to big production, like first round receiver type of production. Could definitely be part of an offense here. And then you also have Burks is one of your few unders on 23.5. So is this fading the athleticism concerns, just the way that the board ends up falling together here?
Yeah, I'm not really even thinking so much about the athleticism concerns. And I'll say it took me a while to get on this bet because I was just trying to fight my inclination to push Burks up the board, because like I will just admit I like him a lot.
Yes.
But the mock draft data is supporting it. I would say the number is 23.5. Like, are you kidding? Like, I can
Yeah.
get him going to the Packers at number 22. Like, I'm not saying
Right.
that is like the worst case scenario for him, but even in some mocks, you will see the Cardinals at number 23 taking a wide receiver. So I even have a shot there for him to go off the board. So this number is, I think, egregious based on what I'm seeing in the mock draft data. Of course, it did scare me a little bit when I saw that Treylon Burks wouldn't be attending the draft, which is just like, oh no, was he not invited to the draft? Because if that's the case, then I'm basically burning money right here. But there's a chance that he was invited and just decided to stay home. That's what I'm hoping happened. But either way, the data that I'm looking at right now, that points me in the direction of going under Treylon Burks 23.5.
Where do you think Burks would have gone if he just said, you know what, I pulled a hammy before before the
Yeah.
drills, and I can't do any of them because London, he's healthy enough to run his 40, and he never did.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you'd assume that means he's probably running like a 4.6 or something, and nobody cares. That guy just keeps on moving up.
Yeah. And I will say, I was actually, I mean, it's like, I was never one of the people who was thinking that he was going to run in the 4.3s or anything like that. Like,
Yes.
just baseline, this is a dude who's 225 pounds. We should expect, if he's athletic, for him to be in the 4.5s and just be happy that that's like a very good number. That's like a Mike Evans type of number. So
Yeah.
I saw a 4.5, 4.55 and thought like, all right, that's cool. Like he's a legit athlete. But yeah, if he hadn't run, I would say, 15 to the Eagles. Like the Eagles would be a perfect landing spot for him. He would be the big bodied complement next to Devontae Smith, maybe even higher. Maybe the Commanders at 11. You could see that, but yeah, I think running, he cost himself some money, but I still think he's going to be a very good NFL player.
Why in God's name are like players like him and DK Metcalf doing the three cone? Like we don't need you to do the three cone. Well, like what is being accomplished here? Do you not have an agent? Do you not have a trainer? Have you never run this before? I mean, Calvin Johnson didn't have to run a three cone to get drafted second overall. So I don't understand what's going on here or why. Because I've heard a couple of times people say Burks did not test like a good athlete, and I'm like, if you run a four 4.55 at 225 pounds, I don't really care what your three cone time is if you're 6'4", 6'3", or whatever. Anyway, I'm a little bit annoyed by that whole thing, but hopefully this is a way to cash in on my annoyance, where normally my annoyance is leading me to somewhere irrational.
Yeah,
Um,
I've got one more
sure,
bet to
go ahead.
close it out on.
Okay, let's do
The
it.
number of cornerbacks in round one over 4.5. I bet this morning plus 130 at Caesars. Think of the cornerbacks that are in this class who are basically a lock to go in the first round. We mentioned Ahmad Gardner, Derek Stingley Jr. I'd say like virtual lock, and then Trent McDuffie, Andrew Booth. Those guys I think have a very good shot. And then you have Kyer Elam. So between the three of those guys, you need to get them in there. I think there's a very good chance of that happening. And then that doesn't even take into account the outlier potential of Daxton Hill, who is listed as a safety, but who potentially could be drafted as a cornerback because of what he can do in the slot. So if they announce him, like again, that's a remote possibility, but it could happen. Even if that doesn't happen, I think you have a good chance of Booth, McDuffie, and Elam all going in the top three. Oh, sorry, to like after the top two to round it out and get it over 5. And this also doesn't take into account Kyler Gordon, who is invited to the draft. Like he's not someone who is routinely mocked in round one, but I think we're going to see him mocked more in the next week because he's been invited to attend the draft.
Okay, you
So
mentioned this draft invitation thing, so I just want to talk
yeah.
about that. Do we have any clue what the process is here for how they're doing it or not? Because you seem to think that it means something more than what you would get from some publicly available information. So I know you don't want to embarrass people by having them show up, but it does make for good television. Like when Matt Crowd does not
Oh,
get drafted in the first round, like he's already going to be on his notes app typing out something about how no one believes in him and everything else, and I'm here for it, quite honestly.
okay. I 100% agree with you. I love the drama, especially of the quarterbacks, watching the
Yeah,
quarterbacks slip down the board. So
yeah.
maybe they are, but I
I'd
will
like to
say
see someone just get like drunk, someone just get wasted during
yeah.
as all the picks are going by. That would be so awesome, but they probably don't allow that. Go ahead.
So two things. One, I have done a little bit of digging to try to get information on the process. Like who is it who's determining this? Is it someone in marketing? What process are they using to make the determinations? Are they just looking at Daniel Jeremiah's mock draft and then deciding, okay, we'll invite the people in this mock? So what is? I have done some digging. I don't want to talk about that anymore, but I have done some digging,
Oh,
and
cryptic.
then outside.
You have to subscribe to Matt's Substack to get that information.
Yeah, Substack, which I just created right now. So that's number one. Number two, even if you don't do any digging, you can just look at the rates that certain guys have. Like if a guy's in the top 10 in mock drafts and he's been invited, like how often does he go in round one? If he's in the bottom 10 and he's invited, how often does he go in round one? So like you can, bucket, you could do, more, you're the data scientist. You could do more sophisticated ways of kind of correlating guys in round one and their expected draft position with the fact that they've attended the combine. So you can do some of that and start to get kind of rates about, like if this guy is invited historically, what has that meant for his probabilistic odds to be drafted on day one. So, I've done some of that work, moron that I am. I'm sure it's not sophisticated, but it's good enough for me to think that it's actionable.
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of like a key point that you're mentioning. Like, you don't want to spend too much time on the sophistication as opposed to knowing what you're researching. So I have to say that's next level. That's next level, my friend. Because if you want to go next level, you have to figure out like when they add the few names at the bottom because some people who were invited didn't come, so then they're adding those names at the bottom. If you can get that for me, then then that Substack will just be blowing up. Is there anything you want to plug before we get out of here, other than your new Substack that we just founded on this episode?
Yeah, anything to plug. Fantasy pros, betting pros. We've got the dynasty draft kit that we launched a couple of weeks ago. We're continuing to add to it. And then of course, after the draft, there will be the furious update that weekend to get all of our rookie rankings, dynasty rankings, all of our projections updated for the people who are going to be doing their dynasty drafts and rookie drafts. And then also at betting pros, putting out all of the draft content there with the prop betting. Discord, subscribe to our Discord where I put all of the bets first before writing them up. So there is literally a tangible benefit to being a part of the Discord community there.
Yeah, no, that's almost like a necessity in some ways. I could see like writing something up and then it changing, and then it gets published, and then the timestamps, and
Yeah.
then trying to figure out when someone actually sees it. All of that going through there. So that's excellent. Great work, my friend. As anyone who's listening can tell, he's in it to maybe somewhat disturbing degree. He's in these draft streets. Follow him on Twitter at Matt F the Oracle. The Oracle. It's still one of my favorite, probably one of the best nicknames, like low key best nicknames in the fantasy space. I appreciate you joining me again, and continued success. And the next time you come on next year, you'll be working for someone else probably. Anyone who's listening here, go ahead, rate and review the pod. Tune in next week. I'll have a couple more pre-draft type of episodes. Otherwise, I'll be talking to everyone then. Thanks again, Matt.